What's going on, everyone? So today we get to dive into some more tournaments that took place last night as well as today. 3, in fact, so we have a lot of top 8s to actually go over. And I'll say this, as of future tournaments and such, if anything surprising happens, I'll definitely be covering that. But it looks like the meta is really starting to shape up to be this sort of really set 3 base, and really starting to see a lot of things like the Anakin Blues, the Jangos, consistently backed up by Sabines, and then, as we mentioned previously, a sprinkling of other decks, which we saw a little bit of that sprinkling today. So we have a bunch of lists to go over, and also some things to talk about. Big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and I have a TCG player link in the description down below. But let's dive into our first top 8. Now, this was, I believe, a continuation, these two here. This was like the first version, and then the second version, or like I assume day 1, day 2, of the... I'm not even going to try to say that, but a tournament in Warsaw, which we got to see the top 8 for both of them. Now, this first one looks like we have, again, the standards. Jangos, Hans, Sabines, more Jangos, more Sabines, okay? All classic stuff. Nothing really surprising. Ray Red, again, not really surprising. Bosk Blue, another one that's not really surprising. All of these are classics. The Jango Reds are very, very prominent. The Ray Reds, very similar in that Tarkin Town strategy. The Han Yellows, consisting of that tempo game plan with the Tech DJ. Sabine ECL, the same deck that we've been seeing since set 1 and set 2, but with you Laurens in them. Bosk Blue, playing like 8 units and then dominating you with a bunch of control events. And then the cool one was the Quinlan Red. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a list to actually talk about, but I have been playing Quinlan Red. I've also played a lot of Quinlan Green. A lot of people are fans of Quinlan, and we've seen Quinlan like sprinkled in here every once in a while. Like I think this is the second or maybe third top 8 that we've seen. I think Quinlan has been decent. The Quinlan Red is much more focused in on that tempo game plan, where you're looking to get down an early unit, match your opponent's early unit, get a damage, target down it away, and set up, similar to how Jango Red does it. But with Quinlan, and this is really cool, you don't need to use these, I don't want to say subpar, but these units that are intended to do additional damage. So for example, what I mean by this is an ISB agent in Jango Red is excellent, but it's still a 1/3 that does 1 damage to something, so you could set up for Jango's ability or Tarkin Town. Quinlan can go ahead and do, okay, your opponent plays a battlefield ring, you play an R2D2, set up your next draws, get a 2/4, and you could still Tarkin Town away their battlefield marine. You don't need to play these setup pieces in order to go ahead and use Tarkin Town way easier. But that also requires you to play off initiative, and it also requires you to match your opponent's units, which could be a little bit tricky sometimes. So I do like Quinlan Red. I have been leaning towards Quinlan Green myself, actually. I've played a lot of Quinlan ECL and Quinlan 30 HP base. Quinlan ECL, you do get that dynamic of having a lot of different things to come down, including Plo Koon and Ayla, and all these different things that just really wreck the board. And something like a Plo Koon ends up doing like 7 damage, assuming you have 2 other units, including Quinlan out, to something that costs 5 or less, which is really, really nice. Overall, I think Quinlan has been pretty solid. So cool to see a Quinlan Red. As for day 2, well, look at that. We've got more Jango Reds, more Bosk Blues, more Anakin Blues, standard. Here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. We have a Bosk Yellow with Petronaki Arena, and this is one of the few Petronaki arenas that we've seen. We've seen Tarkin Town, we've seen ECL. None of those are surprising. This is the first base that we're seeing outside of those, really, in a top 8 spot from set 3. As far as I know, this is the first time. In set 2 and set 1, we saw the occasional security complex. We saw the occasional Jeddah City, and that was pretty much it. We didn't really see anything else, but we, of course, had only the 4 unique bases, so that makes a lot of sense. The question was set 3 going to introduce another ECL type base? And no, that has not happened. But I have always said that Petronaki Arena, out of all of them, has some applications. If they didn't ban Boba, I would have expected to see Boba Yellow with Petronaki Arena very consistently. We see a little bit of Sabine here and there. We didn't see the Sabine Yellow with Petronaki Arena. I was surprised to see that. I would have assumed that Petronaki Arena was the go-to. But this one's really interesting. I would have loved to see a list for Bosk Yellow. We've seen Bosk Yellow in the past. going ahead and taking advantage of things like Wanted or things that are a little bit more tempo oriented and getting you a really nice advantage in the early game. And mind you, boss comes down as a 5/6. That's really, really strong. That's a lot of stats and something that really is going to put a lot of pressure on your opponent. And if you ever double claim a bounty, that can give you a massive tempo advantage on that turn, and that seems pretty interesting. So I'll definitely have to take a look at Boss Yellow and maybe run some games. And then we have 2 Cad Bane Reds. Now, I know a lot of people felt a little bit, I don't want to say like off, but basically they were like, how could you put Cad Bane Red lower on your tier list? I definitely find that I should be putting it up into the A tier, but I am not as high on Cad Bane as a lot of people are. Cad Bane Red is very much a successor to the Boba Reds in the past. It's different from Jango Reds. They went 2 different directions. So the Jango Red focused purely on the space side of things, very little ground units. Boba Red in the past didn't really go into that many space units. Like, it went into a lot of space units, but it wasn't nearly as intense as the new Jango Red. And Cad Bane Red still plays that underworld synergy. You're still getting sometimes the Forloms, the Zuckuses, those types of things, but you're just leveraging that underworld 1 damage ping, and then you're leveraging that into a Tarkin Town activation. Now, one thing I do want to say about Cad Bane Red, I think this is a little bit of a skillful deck that a lot of people are having a little bit more trouble with Cad Bane Red, and that might be why we haven't seen more Cad Bane Reds, because I've played a lot of Cad Bane, and it's something that when I come into opponents' matches or if I'm fighting different opponents, a lot of them are trying to get the most value out of Cad Bane, doing things like passing in order to actually get a Cad Bane trigger because your opponents have a unit out or whatever. That's something that I think a lot of people should be avoiding. You can absolutely pass in certain circumstances, but you need to acknowledge the matchup. Like if you're playing against Sabine Green, for example, and you pass in order to hit their unit, that is worth it, because if they claim and take initiative so that none of you play anything on, like, let's say turn 1, that usually benefits you because you tend to have a little bit more late game power in the deck and a little bit more value across the board, and you don't need to curve out as easily because you have things like Cad Bane being a massive leader compared to Sabine. But if you're fighting, let's say, I don't know, a Bosk Blue, and you're hoping they play like a Dr. Pershing on turn 1, so you pass in order to hit them for 1 damage and maybe try to Tarkin Town away their Dr. Pershing, dealing 4 damage to it total so that it dies next turn. That's something that you don't really want to be doing, because your opponent is less likely to actually play into that and then just take initiative, and then you're passing the turn, getting into late game. So things like that, not to mention various usages of Tarkin Town, how you should be deploying your leader, because it is 2 power base. So you really want to be able to attack, get that 4 hit in. And then, of course, 2 damage on the playing of the units is really important. This is actually a really, really sequence heavy deck, and that's something that's really important, especially in a game that has back and forth actions and the initiative. You need to know when and how you should be using these Cad Bane actions and how you should sequence your plays. So definitely, if you're playing Cad Bane, it is worth a few reps before you actually start playing the deck, because yes, it seems straightforward, but I find that the sequencing ends up being a lot more tricky than a lot of people end up going in and thinking. And then we get to the other tournament, this Win a Showcase, and well, look at that. Jango Reds, Sabine Greens, Anakin Blues, another Cad Bane Red. The interesting ones to me, Palp Green and Yoda Green. So Yoda ECL. Now, I've played a lot of Yoda, and Yoda ECL is extremely powerful. But it is something that has a lot of controlling elements. So it is a little bit more tricky to go ahead and get value out of. So we're really excited, or I'm really excited rather, because these lists are actually available for us to check out, and we will be diving into them. Now, I've only pulled one of the Jango Reds and one of the Sabine ECLs because, well, a lot of them are based on the same lists, and they differ from like 1 to 4 cards or so. Sideboards could be a little bit different as well, but it doesn't seem to be interesting to me to go ahead and dive into each individual minor difference between all the decks. And in fact, yesterday when we talked about the Anakin Blue lists, those lists were 1-to-1 the same in the 50 cards main deck. I believe it was 50 cards. And then the only differences were in the sideboard. So to me, that's less interesting to go over, but Palp Green and Yoda Green are a lot more interesting. And we get to see a Cad Bane Red that we can kind of compare to the other ones. So with that, Jango Red, and Jango Red taking down the tournaments. And, well, Jango Red has absolutely solidified itself as one of, if not the best decks in the format. It's a little bit interesting because I think a lot of people are perceiving Jango Red to be one of the best decks. So again, who knows who's playing what deck? I found Jango Red to be extremely strong. So, well, I don't think it's really that controversial to say that it's at least top 3 in the meta. And that's where I put it on my tier list, at least for right now. But let's dive into our first one. And that is that Jango Red that we got to talk about first off. This one, well, similar to all the other ones that we've been seeing. Who would have thought? We have the standard early game ground units in ISB Agent, Greedos, Death Star Stormtrooper. I actually really like the idea of putting in more one resource plays. This is something that I think a lot of people have started to understand about Star Wars, is that when you are playing one resource plays, you are inherently playing, in general, a weaker play than a 2 resource play. So you need to take advantage of that extra resource that you're laying around, especially on turn 1. Now, this differs later on in the game because you can go like, okay, turn 3, I can play Elite P38 and a 1 resource play. So that gives you a little bit more dynamic and versatility, which is kind of cool. But at least on turn 1, playing like an ISB agent and then doing nothing is a little bit weak, right? It's a little bit weak. Yes, you can go out and get a value out of the Tarkin town, but you're wasting that 1 extra resource. And this list isn't playing Daring Raid. So I've seen situations where you go ISB agent, reveal Daring Raid, hit something with Daring Raid, and deals 3 damage total. That's pretty strong. But you really want to take advantage of that 1 resource. And with the Death Star Stormtroopers and the Greedos, you typically can, because you have 8 turn 1 plays. So there's a lot of options where you actually can get 2 turn 1 plays out in decks. Not like all the time, but like 30 to 50% of the time. I've found, well, if you do a hypergeometric calculator, you'll be able to tell the exact amounts. But when you do have these multiple 1 resource plays, it ends up being pretty solid. As of space units, same stuff that we've been seeing: Silencer, Spacer, things like Tri-Fighter, P38, Tri-Phantom, etc., etc., etc. I think the one interesting part about this list is that we have the 2 of Sneak Attack in the main deck. Now, a lot of people are not running Sneak Attack, but I do think that this is a list that benefits from Sneak Attack because you're looking to tempo out your opponent and then close out the game by getting these Ruthless Raiders, Fet's Fire Sprays down with Triple Dark Raid. And what's cool about it is you can do like Triple Dark Raid, get a Ruthless Raider down on turn 3, and then the following turn, you could Sneak Attack it out and have it ready up again immediately. And then it gets sacrificed. And especially for like a Ruthless Raider, guess what? You end up getting that 4 damage, right? So again, Sneak Attack gives you that 1 resource discount, interplay ready. So turn 3, Triple Dark Raid, cost 5 less, get a Ruthless Raider by paying 1 extra. Next turn, Sneak Attack that Ruthless Raider out, and boom, suddenly you're smacking for tons of damage, right? That's a total of 8 damage with Sneak Attack. So I do find that to be a little bit interesting. Next up, we got the Sabine ECL. Again, nothing too crazy about this list. This list isn't even playing, I don't think, the Yularen. Nope, no Yularen. Still the 2 of Darksaber. Again, Darksaber is one of those cards where it's really good against some decks, and then against Jango Red, which is one of the more prominent decks in the meta, it can be a little bit weak. So it really depends on what you're fighting. But this is like 0 cards from set 3. In fact, 0 from the sideboard, 0 from the main board. It is literally just a set 2 deck, which is kind of crazy. One thing that I do want to add is this list is playing a bunch of early plays, one of them being Rebel Pathfinder. I think people are a little bit sleeping on Rebel Pathfinder and Saboteur units in general in the early game. Things like Crafty Smuggler are very prominent. Village Protector is another one that's really, really prominent in Anakin Blues and Jangos and Cad Banes and all this stuff. Saboteur gives you that option to actually kill their units straight up, which is really, really interesting. And I've actually been playing Rebel Pathfinder in things like Anakin because it also becomes a 4-powered attacker, which is really, really solid. So I definitely think you should just test out the Saboteur units. Not saying that it's absolutely the way to go because it is a 2-powered attacker, whereas things like A-Wing, Marine, and Sabine Red are all 3-powered attackers. But definitely in some matchups, the Saboteur gets a little bit more valuable. But this is just Sabine Green. Sideboard gives you the Sonari Peacekeepers for a little bit of restore, confiscates, heroic sacrifice to get in those big chunks on decks that are not going to let your units live. Timely gives you another ECL later in the game, and then Ewing is just a mid-game, kind of refill engine. It's Sabine Green, guys. This is definitely the most unexciting list out of all of them. It's nothing new, like literally 0 set 3 cards. And even when we do see set 3 cards introduced, it's like a Yularen. And Yularen can be good in some matchups and kind of mediocre in others. So it really depends on how Yularen is being used in that deck. So that's Sabine Green. Who would have guessed? Here's an exciting one though, Palp Green. So here's where we get to see a little bit of some new set 3 cards. And I've been playing quite a bit of Palp Green lately, and I am definitely in that same kind of spot that this player is. So first off, we have a separatist kind of synergy package in the beginning of the game. We have Poggle the Lesser, Masamita, Confederate Courier, Droid Commando. So I've been playing some Palp Green, and if I were to pull up my list here, which I don't know if I will do a video on this soon or later or what, but literally if I just pull up my list here, I don't even think I named it because I was just messing around with it. This has the same separatist package. So this is something that I've kind of landed on as well with Palp Green. Let me just pull this up here. Whoop, there we go. Palp Green, baby. So same thing, 3 of Poggle Lessers. I was running the 3 of Masamitas, but then we also have things like, Confederate Couriers, and I've been messing around with Separatist Commando here off and on, and that's seemingly something that a lot of people are kind of keeping track of. Droid Commando is a card that is exceptionally good. If you're able to get the ambush off on this, it's a turn 2 4/3 ambush, which is insane, especially against things like Queel, Sabine Wren, any turn 1 play that has 2 power. This thing lives through it and is absolutely insane. And especially if you like a Poggle, you also get to create a battle droid token, which is excellent. Not to mention, Poggle and Masamita are both officials, which work with Emperor's Royal Guard, which ends up being extremely strong as well. In terms of other units that we've got in the ground side of things, we've got the Hu Yangs, which end up being pretty nice, especially with like Poggle the Lesser, making him a 3/6. Just ends up being something that can kill things and survive for a long time, but also just getting you some value in general, pumping up a unit and letting it survive. The Confederate Couriers, another separatist unit that works with the Droid Commando, but also really good against things like Silencer, things like Mercenary Gunship, etc. We also have Subjugating Starfighter, little ambusher coming in through the space arena, helping you deal with some of the space focused decks. And we also have Merciless Contest, which I think is an excellent addition to the deck. This is another one that I've been messing around with a lot, especially in the more controlling decks, but I think in Palpatine it makes a lot of sense, especially since you have a lot of units that you do not care about. Things like Crumb, things like Confederate Courier, things like Poggle creating droid tokens. All these things you don't have any issues just defeating and then getting one of your opponent's more valuable units, which ends up being really good. Of course, the whole deck revolves around ramping with your commands, your resupplies, your super laser technicians, and all that type of stuff, and then getting down some big threats to close out the game, and of course Palpatine himself to steal some stuff. It's a strong list. I don't think it's like anywhere insane or anything like that, but I definitely think it's one to be on the lookout for, because I do think Palp Green and Palp Yellow have gotten some really nice stuff from set 3. So definitely something that I've been experimenting with myself. Next up, we got a Yoda ECL, and by far this is my favorite of them all. It's the one I was most excited about to talk about today, but in general it's just got a lot of things going for it. So starting us off in the earlier plays, and I'll move my stuff over so you guys can see a little bit better. Ryloth Militia is one of those cards where I have been really high on. This is just a Battlefield Marine, and Battlefield Marines are really good. Just a 3/3 stat line, assuming you're on the attacks. It's a lot weaker on defense, of course, because it doesn't trade with those 3 toughness units if they have 3 power. But on attacks, it has that raid 1, which I think is really valuable. Now, this deck only has 9 turn 1 plays, which is a little bit on the lower side of things, because there's going to be a good portion of the time, like 40% of the time, I think it's like 35 or 40% of the time, you're not going to have a turn 1 play, which is really weak if you're not mulliganing every game. But the Yodas, the Echo Base, Concord Dawn Interceptors, the Village Protectors, all on turn 2 help make up for that. The Sentinels coming down, especially Village Protectors, just gives you so much value. And then as you go up the curve, you got your Kanans, your Bright Hopes, giving you that nice ECL potential with Kanan. The Bright Hope's giving you more Sentinels. You have modded cohorts for ambushing. And then we talk about some more set 3 cards in the Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite and the A-Lab. And these two are your main ECL targets. Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite can completely wipe your opponent's space arena. Completely wipe. It can potentially kill, and oftentimes does, 3 different space units when you ECL this out. Yes, it will die, but you killed 3 space units. If your opponent starts and they're playing Jango Red, they go TIE Silencer into turn 2 P38, into turn 3 play like a space unit and 1 drop, and you just drop this Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite. You get to kill a unit, and hit the other unit with your Ether Sprite, which is absolutely amazing. And if they don't use that P38 trigger on either sprite, it can actually even live, which is absolutely crazy, right? Ayla, with all the sentinels and stuff that you have, oftentimes won't have the coordinate, but it's still a very, very high power unit to ambush out. And if you do use it when you have things like village protectors or conquer down interceptors, these awkward sentinels that your opponent don't really want to deal with, you will have coordinate, which is pretty nice. And of course, this is backed up by your late game powerhouse in Heroism, Command, Vigilance, Home Ones, Luke's, Zillow Beast, Chewbacca, with a little bit of removal, Perilous Position, Fell the Dragons, Rivals Fall, things like that. The one spice card of this list, and I think this is something that a lot of Yoda players are running, is You're My Only Hope. This allows you to kind of go ahead and put something on the top of the deck, and then gives you the option to kind of get that there are two of them effect, but without actually having a unit on the board. So what's really cool about this is Yoda, turn 1, you play your Battlefield Marine. Turn 2, maybe your opponent Turkin Towns it or whatever, or you trade in with your unit or something like that. Use Yoda's action. You put an Ayla on the top of your deck, or an Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite on the top of your deck, right? You draw a card, put one on top, you play You're My Only Hope, and suddenly you wipe your opponent's entire space arena because you just played Obi-Wan's Ether Sprite on turn 2. Absolutely amazing. It's one of the things that makes Yoda really, really interesting to play against and really, really tough in some of those scenarios. Also, one of the reasons why I like Yoda Yellow, because you get to play You're My Only Hope, and you get to play another or two of them, and they work well together because they're kind of just events that expand upon the things that you're already playing, which is really, really good. So really, really cool stuff. This is a list that I have been playing a lot. Not exactly, but very similar. I've been playing Yoda 30 HP and Yoda ECL. I personally find Resupply to be a really nice card in the deck because there are some matchups where if you can just get that Resupply and you can get Yoda down early, it can completely take over the game. But this list does not have that. Same also applies to Fell the Dragon versus Takedown. I prefer Takedown just on the meta and how it is right now, or at least doing a split like 2 Takedown, 1 Fell the Dragon. Because if you're against like Jango Red, Fell the Dragon's like really, really weak, right? Doesn't kill P38, doesn't kill Ruthless Raider, doesn't kill basically anything but Fet's Fire Sprite for the most part, which could be a little bit tricky. Next up, we've got Cad Bane Red, and I think this is the last deck we got to talk about, and it is the one that a lot of people are on for sure in terms of seeing a lot of value out of Cad Bane. Now, this one's interesting. As I said, it's much more of a ground-based strategy than a space-based strategy oftentimes in what we're seeing with Cad Bane lately. It's not like a triple arc raid deck. There are some decks that are, but most decks are not. They're just valuing you with a bunch of good underworld units, and because you're playing all underworld units because of Cad Bane, oftentimes they're playing now there are 2 of them, and that can be extremely powerful. One of the things with this deck is you get to curve out, and you get to do some good stuff with it. Things like Crafty Smuggler are absolutely amazing against your opponent's Jango Red, because Crafty Smuggler now removes their Crafty Smuggler shield just by playing it, which is huge, right? Couple of cool cards that I've really, really liked in this deck. Jabba the Hutt. And actually, we don't see it in this one, but Bib Fortuna. Bib Fortuna has been a nice one. Bib Fortuna, with now there are 2 of them, can actually allow you to get down a 6-drop underworld unit, which is really, really interesting. Of course, it's not in this list, but also Jabba can allow you to kind of play these tricks for a little bit cheaper as well. Let's say you have a Jabba on the battlefield, turn 4, you got 5 resources. You play now, there are 2 of them for 2 resources, giving you the option to play a Zuckuss plus a Boba Fett on the same turn, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? So really, really interesting because you're playing a lot of tricks, right? You got Maklunki, which can be absolutely free. You're playing now, there are 2 of them, which is a really, really nice addition. You have Waylays, which people have been playing all the time, and then Sneak Attack, which works specifically well with the Ruthless Raider. It's also good with things like Zero the Hutt, or things like the Cad Bane, so you can go ahead and capture things, basically exhausting your entire opponent's board and then attacking with it immediately, which could be really, really powerful. But overall, the whole deck is revolving around value, 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 stall out your opponent a little bit with things like No Good To Me Dead, Waylays, Maklunkis, and then suddenly drop things like now there are 2 of them, getting massive units into play, and then just killing off your opponents just by playing your own units, which is really, really nice. So I have been really, really enjoying Cad Bane in general. I mentioned this at the beginning of set 3 that I think Cad Bane will be one of those decks to be on the lookout for, as it's something that will be kind of filling in Boba's shoes alongside Jango's and alongside Asajj and things like that. But Cad Bane Red has kind of solidified itself as a little bit of a different strategy as a successor from Boba Red. Jango Red's definitely the space variant, and then I think the Cad Bane Red ends up being a little bit more strong if you're going to go for the ground strategy, because you do get to go ahead and get a lot more control over the board by doing this 1 damage basically every single turn. So really, really strong stuff. And that's going to wrap up all the lists that we actually have to go over for the most part. Again, there are duplicate Jango Reds, duplicate Sabine Greens, which I don't think are worthwhile to go ahead and investigate, unless there's something that's like, ooh, there's a Jango Red with now there are 2 of them, ground version and not space version. But as I said, going forward in the future weeks, unless we see something absolutely crazy, I'll definitely do a wrap up every week in terms of meta, because I just enjoy talking about the decks that are in the meta and seeing some new cards that people are pulling up. I don't think we're going to see a really big shakeup until planetary qualifiers. And this is the same thing that happened with set 2, where set 2 was like, okay, we're seeing Bobas, we're seeing Sabines, we're seeing Hans. Han Yellow's the best deck of the whole format. That's what a lot of people were saying. We're seeing Palpatine Greens. Some people were saying Palpatine Green was the best deck of the format. Come planetary qualifiers, what is it? Boba Green, Boba Red, Boba Yellow. I think Boba is a little bit of an let's say something that won't happen again, hopefully, because we're not seeing like a complete domination, right? So I don't think it's going to be that big of a difference. Again, all the tournaments before, yes, we saw Boba Fett, but it wasn't like 50% Boba Fett. That's not what was happening. And so I think when we're seeing these super competitive tournaments, people are bringing what they believe to be the absolute best. Whereas right now, we're seeing things like the Bosk Yellow pop up and the Yoda Greens and the Palp Greens that are popping up here and there, which I would be surprised to see a lot of them come planetary qualifiers. Maybe it will just be the Sabine Greens, Jango Reds, and things like that. Or maybe things will take a different turn. So right now, that's the meta. Jango Reds, Sabine Greens, Han Yellows, Anakin Blues, most common. Follow that up with Rey Reds, Bosk Blues, Cad Bane Reds, and, well, a sprinkling of other things. So expect that to be what you should be testing against, because that's what you should be expecting to see as of right now. And my thought process is, if you're going to be able to do well against Sabine Green and Anakin Blue and Jango Red all at the same time, your deck's probably pretty good, and maybe it will break the meta, right? There are some different strategies. Anakin Blue is much more value mid-range. Sabine's more like aggressive aggro / mid-range. Jango's all about tempo and getting you out through the space. So very different strategies and angles of attack, and something that you'll have to keep in mind when you're building your main deck and your sideboard. And that's, of course, where the sideboard comes in. So thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what surprised you, anything that you want to talk about in terms of meta, and I'll see you all for the next one.